Right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everybody so much for being here today. My name is Daniel Susi, and I am a research analyst with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We know that you all are very busy and pulled in a number of different directions, so we really appreciate you taking the time to think about and collaborate with us on this really important topic. And thank you all for your interest in this topic and for the work that you do to cover it. So just before we begin, I wanted to go through some quick housekeeping notes. This presentation is being recorded and a copy will be distributed to everyone who is registered following today's event. Sorry, let me just make sure I'm sharing the right screen. I realized that, okay, yep, there we go. So please feel free to use the Q&A function for questions. Alliance staff will monitor these questions and ensure that the panelists have a chance to respond to as many as possible. This is a fairly small group, so hopefully we can get to as many questions as possible. So to start off today, I'm just going to give you all a deeper look at the data sources and analysis that we conduct to produce our annual State of Homelessness report. Our goal with the report this year was to format the data in a way that improves its accessibility for practitioners, policymakers, and reporters, while also telling an evidence-driven story of homelessness trends in the United States in 2023. Following this introduction, I have the pleasure of introducing two wonderful reporters who will join a discussion with my colleague, Libby Miller, for the majority of today's webinar. And then, like I said, we'll conclude with a open question and answer session. And if anything does come up, please feel free to reach out to Libby with any questions that we are not able to answer today. So while I spend a lot of my time analyzing and collecting data, reading and listening to media introduces me to new local, state, and national contexts that I think is really important. It's a form of data that is invaluable to our understanding of the housing and affordability crisis. My hope is really to provide some insight into how we think about the local, state, and national data included in the State of Homelessness report. And by doing so, I can add some new considerations to your conversations with the many groups and people who plan, lead, and engage with the homeless response system. We previously conducted a webinar for the public that dives into the data and highlights solutions to homelessness. Since I will only briefly mention some of the actual trends in the homelessness data, I encourage you to look at the report itself, the State of Homelessness 2024 edition. But the webinar recording is also available on our website, as is a number of other research and evidence sources to learn more from. So this is a list of the various sources we rely on in our work more broadly, but also in the State of Homelessness. I will explain some of the ways that we use these sources to tell a data-driven story of homelessness and solutions to homelessness, and also briefly mention some of the limitations that exist in the data that we have access to. First, an important source for framing how we understand the causes of and solutions to homelessness in the United States is the US Census, and specifically the American Community Survey, the American Housing Survey, and the population estimates. These surveys report housing costs, housing quality, housing tenure, poverty, and income, among other things. And we use their data to highlight indicators that can be helpful for communities as they try to identify households most at risk of experiencing homelessness, and helpful to policymakers as they try to fund programs that prevent these households from losing their housing. Specifically, we do a series of calculations using the American Community Survey data to report how many people pay more than 50% of their income on rent disaggregated by race. Additionally, we pull census population data to explore doubled up homelessness. This is the number of households who are living with friends or family out of financial necessity. We also rely on the census's population estimates to calculate per capita rates of homelessness, or the number of people experiencing homelessness divided by the total population for a given state or community. The census publishes additional, more frequent survey results that may be useful to your reporting as well. We don't all use these in the state of homelessness, but the Household Pulse Survey and community resilience estimates provide data about various indicators of household well-being. Among other things, they highlight financial and housing instability, access to basic necessities, health, poverty, and climate-related displacement. All important factors as we consider who may need additional resources to remain housed and how people are faring in the current economic and social climate. New releases of these data happen regularly, and actually the 2023 American Community Survey was just released today. The census also offers data training to help reporters and researchers access the data they need in case that's something that interests you. And I should just note that while these are some screenshots of the visualizations that we use in the report and that we create using the data, they are meant to be interacted with. And so if you go to our website or to the report itself, you can actually click on them and play around with the data. In addition to describing risk of homelessness, we also analyze the annual homelessness assessment report to Congress from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is also known as the AHAR, since that's quite a mouthful. And we use that to describe literal trends in literal homelessness rather than risk. So part 1 of the AHAR is the primary source in the state of homelessness, and it reports point in time count data or PIT data. This is the annual count of people experiencing sheltered and unsheltered homelessness on a single night in January each year. And while there are some critiques of the PIT for possibly undercounting homelessness that we should be aware of, it remains extremely helpful. Specifically, it indicates trends in homelessness related to gender, race, and household type, age, and shelter status, like I said, and geography. And again, that's on a single night in January each year. This is a huge community and volunteer-driven effort. And like I said, it's extremely useful in part because it can tell us about how homelessness changed since the previous year or multiple years. It also evolves to respond to advocates, meet current needs, and address changing trends. So for example, this year was the first year that HUD included detailed age categories in its report, helping us point out the concerning increase in older adult homelessness in particular. The AHAR Part 1 also reports the housing inventory count, or the HIC, also extremely useful. Communities share their system's housing inventory and specifically the number of beds available in temporary shelter, as well as the number of units available in permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, and other permanent housing. These numbers help us understand the country's capacity to serve people experiencing homelessness. Specifically, we compare the number of people who are experiencing homelessness with the number of temporary shelter beds. This is what we label as the capacity. We also demonstrate how changes in the number of beds and changes in the number of people experiencing homelessness impacted this emergency capacity year over year, as well as for the past 15 years. For example, if there were 100 shelter beds and 100 individuals experiencing homelessness in 2022, but in 2023, the number of people experiencing homelessness increased to 150, but the number of shelter beds did not change. The deficit increased by 50, and the community now has capacity for just 67% of its population, compared to 100% in the previous year. Separately, we also calculate the number of beds that are empty versus the number of individuals or families sleeping in an unsheltered situation. And we label this as the utilization. In addition to analyzing trends in this temporary shelter, we also show the number of permanent housing, resources, or units available at the national, state, and local level. Both the temporary shelter counts and the permanent housing counts are extremely important. While temporary shelter can guarantee someone a place to stay safe during extreme weather events, as well as access really important services, among other things, the data consistently tells us that permanent housing ends homelessness. And so what we see is that in many places, service workers do not have the resources they need to provide both adequate permanent housing and adequate temporary shelter. And so they're forced to make challenging decisions about which one to prioritize. By clicking on the different states and communities, again, on the website or in Tableau itself, not here, but on our website, you can see not just the demographics of people experiencing homelessness, but as I've noted, also the population compared to the resources available to support them in a given community, state, or at the national level. We also reference part 2 of the annual homelessness assessment report to Congress. The second part captures data over the course of the entire year and requires more time for collection, cleaning, and then release from HUD. Therefore, it's released much later than the AHAR Part 1. The most recent AHAR Part 2 was released and most recently discussed the 2022 data. Despite this lag, the AHAR Part 2 helps us and may also help you understand the impact that robust and sustained investment in preserving and expanding housing and services has on ending homelessness. For example, the AHAR Part 2 tells us that the majority of people experiencing homelessness are consistently doing so for the first time. It also tells us that the number of people entering homelessness for the first time exceeds the number of people exiting. So while permanent housing effectively ends homelessness, there's simply not enough available to meet this demand. And since this webinar should help you report on homelessness, I think it's also worth explaining some of the nuance in how we think about these numbers and what they tell us about the potential progress on homelessness. For example, a large number of available beds relative to the number of people sleeping outside, in other words, a low utilization rate that I just described, could indicate a number of different things that would be worth investigating. On the one hand, this could reflect the fact that providers have too few resources, and without enough resources, they may struggle to invest the time necessary to identify and build relationships with people in need. And this is really a necessary process to bring people inside. On the other hand, this could indicate that the lack of resources is impacting the comfort and safety of temporary or permanent housing locations. In the places that do not have enough beds, people experiencing homelessness may be making a very rational decision that the available beds in a shelter are not a better option than sleeping outside. Of course, there are other reasons as well. Some shelters may have restrictions on pets and family members. Others may make it impossible for gender expansive people to feel safe and welcome. Using trends in the data you're reporting can help determine these reasons, or ones even that I failed to mention, as there may be a number of different ones. Understanding not just the numbers, but what they mean in a particular context is helpful and important. And in our role as researchers, we really rely heavily on academic experts, people with lived expertise of homelessness, practitioners, and reporters to inform our work and our understanding of the challenges that communities face. The links in the report could also help point you to some of those additional sources of information, so we encourage you to click through and take a look. Hopefully, by explaining some of these sources we use and questions we grapple with as researchers, it's helpful. But if you have follow-up questions or comments that we aren't able to answer today, please, again, reach out to Libby. But now I'm most excited to welcome our two guests today. In the state of homelessness, as I mentioned, we try to not only identify the problem, but also highlight some communities and groups that have experienced declines in homelessness, who have demonstrated that progress is possible with resources and planning. These two journalists can teach us so much about how to do this more effectively. I think that not only do they identify a problem, but they also try to offer nuanced solutions that point to both the advantages and the limitations of a given approach. And they're going to provide you all with resources on how to do that effectively. So first, I'm pleased to introduce Emilie Stigliani, who is the Assistant Managing Editor with the Sacramento Bee, as well as a network instructor with the Solutions Journalism Network. Thank you for your work and for being here today, Emilie. I am also pleased to introduce Lisa Halverstadt. Lisa is a senior investigative reporter with the Voice of San Diego, where she has been consistently covering affordable housing and homelessness for a number of years. Thank you also for your work and for being here, Lisa. And my colleague, Libby Miller, Media Relations Specialist with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, will be leading the discussion. Thank you all again, and I'm really excited to hear what we all have to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you, Lisa and Emilie, for joining us. So I'm going to kick it off. We're going to start with Lisa, a couple questions for Lisa first, and then I'm going to have Emilie kind of go over a little bit about what solutions journalism is and how that might be used when thinking about reporting about homelessness. So Lisa, I know you've been covering this for quite a couple years. So maybe you want to dig in a little bit on your background, and then what have you learned, in your years on reporting on homelessness that potentially, someone newer to the beat, might want to think about as they're going about writing about this.
Well, first off, thank you so much for including me in this. I'm very excited to be part of it. I would say short answer is I've learned so much. I have been reporting on homelessness in San Diego since late 2015, which kind of makes me an OG of this topic, which kind of is amusing to me now. But I had covered a wide variety of beats prior, everything from public safety to city hall and finance, government finance issues. And I really feel like I use all of that knowledge that I built from those beats now. So I'm kind of forcing myself to give a few bullet points of things that I've learned, though, covering this beat that I wish I had known. So one is that there are no silver bullets here. Every person has a bit of a different story and a different path. And anybody who's trying to say that, whether it's a specific type of housing or a specific type of shelter is the solution to homelessness, I wish it was that easy, folks. It's not. And this is a beat that has a lot of intersections with other beats that I think we need to keep in mind when we're doing these stories. So housing, behavioral health, criminal justice, the history of our nation, and also our local social service systems. And I think one thing too is early on, I will say, I was very focused, especially as a lot of our readers and viewers are, on the chronically homeless population because they are the most visible. But as I've covered this, I've gotten a lot more interested in people who are falling into homelessness because there's something that I've learned. And I think Anna Oliva, the head of National Alliance, was one of the first people to really teach me this. If you want to reduce homelessness, you have to do three things, not just one thing, not just house people. You have to prevent people from falling into homelessness, which a lot of our systems across the country are really not set up to effectively do at scale. When somebody becomes homeless, you have to quickly house them and resolve their situation. And you have to successfully house those people that are chronically homeless who've been on the street for a while and keep them housed. And I can say in my community and across California, communities are not doing a good job of that. And I just use California because that's the state I happen to reside in. I have also learned it is really, really crucial to include people with lived experience and who are currently experiencing homelessness in your reporting. Their experiences can often be really revealing and really tell us what is working and what isn't working. And, kind of referring back to what I said about the silver bullet solution, or, comments that we'll often hear about people not accepting services. It's really important to hear from people that are experiencing homelessness because they're often the experts about why a service isn't working or why something is working for a little bit, but maybe not over the long haul. I learned so much from them. And I think another thing I've learned, to wrap it up, is just that we need to be really intentional when we're reporting on homelessness, and we're talking to people that are experiencing it. So it's really important to be aware of how you're going about your job and how that might affect the person that you're talking to. It's important to think about being really transparent about what you're trying to do, what your story is, because this person that you're meeting on the street, they're not as familiar with how the media works as, say, the mayor or someone else that we might encounter in our jobs. So I often have to be transparent multiple times and really create multiple instances of consent to make it really clear to that person what's going to be happening. I think we also have to kind of wrap up this answer here, really think about how the stories that we're writing or producing are going to impact the people that we're including in them. So, for example, we have to think about how there may be details that are really interesting, but could actually do harm if we include them in our stories that are not really relevant to what we're reporting on. So, for example, maybe we don't want to provide the exact location of an encampment where somebody's staying because that could lead to a safety issue for that person or to police sweeping the area. We may want to cover that sweep, but if we're creating a sweep, there's some questions raised along with that if we create that police activity that wouldn't have happened without us. Also, I run into a lot of people that are victims of crimes, especially domestic violence. They may not want to include their full name or have you include certain details that would be identifying. And that's something that I'm really open to in a way that I wasn't in the past. A lot of times I won't publish somebody's full name after a discussion with them about how if I do, maybe their abuser will find them, or even, other people in their lives or jobs might be impacted because people don't know that this person is homeless at their work.
That's great. Really appreciate that answer. So I think you came with some examples, and I think, sometimes you're going to see this play out in motion. So can you kind of talk about maybe how you use, data to sometimes tell your stories? As Daniel just talked about, there's quite a bit of data out about homelessness trends and things that we're seeing across the country. And so would love to sort of maybe walk through some examples of some stories that you've written.
Definitely. So I am very focused on looking at the benchmarks that various agencies have set for themselves, goals or targets that they've set for themselves. Two really easy things that folks can look for: homeless service contracts. What are the targets that they're setting for housing or income or other things that they want them to reach? Another really useful tool is if your community has a homelessness plan. That's often a great place to look to see what goals have they set and what sorts of data are they tracking. To give a couple examples too, if we want to pull up the PowerPoint, while you're doing that, I'll go on a little bit, but I also like to look for data that speaks to things that I'm hearing about, just as I'm sure we do on all of our beats. If we're not, if not everybody's on the homelessness beat. But also there's data that I keep a close track on, like I said, especially, for example, looking at, are we successfly housing people that are coming into shelters? And so this first example, if we want to go to the next slide, is I, on a pretty regular basis, am looking to see what percentage of people who are leaving city shelters, since we're investing a lot more in those shelters in the city of San Diego, are actually moving into housing. And in this particular story you see here, I found that it wasn't looking great, that the community was really struggling to move people into housing. Through that process, I learned about some other data sets too that I wanted to highlight. And, I think they're putting the link in the chat so you can pull that up. But I looked at, what percentage of people are moving into housing or other programs. I ended up looking at one thing that was really revealing is the length of time that people were spending in shelter was growing quite a bit. I was kind of hearing that from people sometimes, like, oh, wow, I'm surprised, like, you're still in a shelter because I know you're working so hard on your housing. Well, it was turning out that what they call length of stay in a lot of the contracts and also in various homeless management systems that they're tracking is that the length of time that people were spending in shelter before getting housed was really rising. And that was very revealing. To get this kind of data, a lot of your contractors in your communities will be having to report monthly how many people they're housing providing a little bit of narrative about challenges sometimes that they're having. So that's an easy way if you want to request those monthly reports. And that really comes down to also just reading that contract and seeing how are they required to report data. To go to my next example, I'll talk about one that I had to kind of come up with a unique way of getting the data. So in San Diego, as in some of your communities, I'm sure they're exploring these safe campgrounds where people can stay. And these are different programs than a traditional shelter. A lot of times they're trying some new things. Sometimes there's a lighter service model. And the contracting for this one was handled a little bit differently than a traditional shelter contract, in part because the city wasn't sure what housing outcomes it was going to get. So it was kind of reluctant to set specific standards for them to try to meet. And in San Diego, I'm lucky enough to be able to look at a dashboard on a regular basis that gives me some data about what's happening after people go to shelter. But this particular one, there wasn't that data. So after having conversations with sources and really just looking at even like other records requests that I had done in the past and others had done, I ended up actually requesting, and I'm going to give you this exact term so that you can write this down if you're having trouble getting data, the HUD annual performance reports. So I know that if a program is in the homeless management information systems, which all of your communities have some sort of system that's tracking what's happening with homeless people in the community that are being served by various shelters or even housing programs, they have to input data into the system. And the people working on these databases can press a few buttons and they can produce these monthly reports or reports for a period of time that say what the outcomes are for various programs. So that's something that might be helpful if you're having trouble getting data. Also, just offer up if you're trying to get data on the outcomes of programs in your communities and you're having trouble, please feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to brainstorm with you. Let's go to the next slide. This one is really important. So one dynamic in San Diego that I was noticing for a while as I was hearing about more people becoming homeless, and I was struggling to get like county-wide numbers of any sort that would tell me what is the inflow and outflow of homelessness. You might want to write that specific term down, inflow, outflow, because in the homeless service system, they, increasingly communities are talking about, as I was mentioning before, to reduce homelessness, you have to increase the outflow and reduce the inflow of people becoming homeless. Well, in San Diego, after some conversations, and I'll take a little credit, I was really pushing our Continuum of Care Council, our regional group that tracks a lot of data on homelessness, to put out numbers that would show how many people are becoming homeless and how many people are being housed. And so this story, and you can see the numbers there, but if you click on the link, but this story was the first time I was able to get my hands on that data. And it's become really revealing because what this data has made clear is we have many more people that are becoming homeless than we're housing. Even though as a system, San Diego is housing hundreds of people, sometimes more than 1,000 people regionally each month. If we have more people that are becoming homeless and accessing services, we've got a math problem. So that's one that's, I think, really important. And next slide, one more example for everyone. So I talked about how there are often intersections with other beats. And I see housing definitely as one that's really important for us to track on this beat where there are intersections. And I just have heard for years, as many of you have probably heard in your communities, about people struggling to get Section 8 vouchers that HUD gives out in cooperation with local communities to help people subsidize their rent. And these vouchers often both prevent somebody from becoming homeless if they can get them, and also help to get people into housing. And so I started just asking a lot of questions of our local housing agency in San Diego of how many vouchers do you have to give out? How is that changing? How is the subsidy per voucher changing? And what I found was that the subsidy per voucher, because housing costs are going up, the subsidy per voucher was rising. And that meant that our housing agency in San Diego has fewer vouchers to give out. So that means less homelessness prevention. And in some cases too, it could mean more people becoming homeless because they can't access a voucher. What I ended up finding out through a lot of back and forth and questioning was that San Diego's housing agency has not given out new vouchers to new families for about 2 years now. That took a lot of back and forth to get them to kind of acknowledge that. But that was something I think that was really revealing, kind of adjacent to direct reporting on homelessness, but very much has impacts on solutions for homelessness.
Wow, that was great. Thank you for sharing all that. So to sort of close up, I know you talked a little bit about sort of the importance of including folks with lived experience, but maybe can you touch on, how you go about sort of finding those individuals and how do you build those relationships?
Great question. This is super important. So I would say that some of my best sources have been from being introduced by someone that they trusted. So I often will go out with outreach teams, and I really invested a lot of time in that, especially when I was new on the beat, to have somebody that person trusts say, hey, this is Lisa. You can trust her. Here's what she's trying to do. Really went a long way. I also will have people on the street introduce me to their friends. A lot of times we'll be just interviewing and they'll say, you know what, John really has something to say about that. You really need to talk to him. I've gotten some great sources that way too. I've also worked with service providers sometimes to, I'll say, for example, on the story I shared about people struggling to get housed out of shelters, I, talked to them about these things I had been hearing about people struggling to get housed. And one of the providers, he was like, oh my gosh, we have just the guy that you have to talk to because we've been working so hard to get him housed and he's been here since like COVID times. So that was really helpful. I do also sometimes go out and hit the street on my own and talk to people. When I do that though, I think it's really important to be aware of again, how you're presenting yourself and how that can impact the person. So when we're going up to somebody's tent, we have to treat it like we're walking up to somebody's home. We shouldn't immediately, do a live shot in front of somebody's home that's not a public figure. So we wouldn't do that outside a shelter and encampment without talking to people and getting their consent. And I find that a lot of times, my full disclosure about things, I'll often be very open, hey, I don't really know what the story is yet, or I'm trying to figure out, and I'll kind of try to enroll people in what I'm trying to do. And I find out so many people want to help when they can tell that you are really genuine about trying to figure something out and that you really want to hear from them. I just find it goes such a long way because many of these people that you will meet on the homelessness beat, people walk past them and disregard them, or they feel like society doesn't care about them. And so you just being genuine and really showing that you see them as, someone who has valuable insights to provide can go a really long way. I know one thing some folks are probably thinking about too is how do you make sure that you're able to vet the information that people are sharing too? Some things that I've come up with over time is sometimes I'll have people tell the same story multiple times if I'm not sure that they're remembering things correctly. And I can kind of use that to figure out okay, we have some inconsistencies here. Maybe I need to find other sources to try to help validate. I'll also ask them who else knows about this, or I've written about homeless hospital patients and have been fortunate enough to have them go through the process, literally driving one woman to the hospital to have her sign paperwork so that I could get her medical records, and they had to be handed to her, and she then handed them to me after we left the hospital so I could document her hospitalizations. Also, I just think it's really important to say that when you are going out and talking to people in homeless camps or at shelters, people who've gone through some stuff often, it's really important to not try to rush those conversations. You want to make sure that you take time. And I often am very proactive about telling my editors hey, I'm going to be out in the field for a while today. I may be sort of incommunicado for a while. What I've found is that when you have longer conversations with people, just like we would with our friends, we often figure out like what's really going on. So like often, somebody will say, how are you doing? And you might say fine when you're not really fine. The same goes for the homeless population because they're just like us in many ways. And so I often find if I can have a deeper conversation, I really get to the root of what's actually going on or what may be sort of uncomfortable. And when we have that conversation, sometimes people kind of realize, oh, she's a reporter. And we talk through, okay, like what are the sensitivities, if there are sensitivities? I need to tell an accurate story here. And I do see that as kind of a piece of being trauma informed too, of recognizing like put this person in the driver's seat a little bit more than you would with a typical source because they're not used to dealing with the media. And often these stories, like I say this all the time, for us, it's a story, for them, it's their life. And so we have to be aware that sometimes the questions we're asking can be triggering, or sometimes there can be fear about, being really honest about something. And so we just have to be patient about working that through the process and being really transparent. And often, like, also just giving, I think I mentioned before, multiple layers of consent, where that means that, if I'm out and I'm talking to Libby today, the first conversation, I'm really clear, I'm a reporter. I want to take notes on what you're saying. As I get closer to the story, if there's something sensitive, I may actually go out and try to find that person again, or call them or text them to just say, hey, here's what I'm hearing. And there have also been instances, and I do not do this for every story, but there are instances where I actually have read the passage in the story to the person because maybe the story is just literally like their whole life wide open. Or there's something that's really sensitive, and it just helps them feel comfortable, especially if they've gone through a lot of trauma, to know that they're safe. And to really also, it's an opportunity sometimes to fact check, because they might say, well, that's not quite it. The sky wasn't blue that day, it was kind of gray. So those things can be really mutually helpful too, just to kind of have one last chance to touch base and make sure that they're okay. Because I always come back to, I'm a longtime SPJ member, and we have a concept in our code of ethics called do no harm. And so I am just thinking about that all of the time when I'm out on the street, or, doing stories with people that have gone through trauma, or, who just may be especially vulnerable. So I'll stop there. I've said a lot, but there's so much, so much.
You're clearly like, we're big fans of sort of your reporting, and very thankful that, you've had the consistency of covering the issue for numerous years. So if anyone has any questions or wants to talk through a story, you can either put it in the Q&A, or I'm sure Lisa will be happy to connect with you after. So I'm going to turn it over to Emilie, we're going to shift a little bit into like clear examples of stories, but really big picture this out, and sort of understand this concept of solutions journalism. So we hear a lot about problems going on in the country. Of course, homelessness is one of those issues that, is talked about quite often, but trying to frame it in a way where we're actually moving the needle a little bit forward. So I'm going to hand it over to Emilie, who's going to kind of walk us through what is solutions journalism a little bit, why it's important, and how we might frame that conversation as we're talking about homelessness and housing.
Great, thank you, Libby, and thank you everyone for being here. I think this is really important, and I feel like our collective conversations are what can help us strive to, as journalists, to offer our communities better coverage on this topic that affects almost every community in this country, as a lot of the data that the National Alliance has put forward. Just a tiny bit of my background with solutions journalism, because some of you are probably well aware of solutions journalism and the Solutions Journalism Network. Many of you have probably worked with solutions frames and solutions lenses, even if you're not officially looking at what the Solutions Journalism Network has sort of set out on how to frame stories. I came to the Solutions Journalism Network, really in search of guidance on how to cover hard and thorny issues in a way that offered people hope, including myself. I had been in Vermont for a long time, and we had a opioid crisis, and our coverage was just repeatedly covering court cases where people were being incarcerated for, the sale of opioids, and we were covering opioid deaths. And I just felt like at some point it was the same sad story over and over again, and I had edited those stories repeatedly, and those are important, but I was depressed about it, and I was thinking the reader has to have fatigue around all of this as well. And how do I bring myself some hope, and how do I bring the readers a productive avenue to discuss how we could improve the issue? So I had heard a webinar with Tina Rosenberg, who's one of the founders of the Solutions Journalism Network. And if you haven't heard of her or read anything that she's written, she was involved in writing the fix for the New York Times for a long time, and then sort of leveraged that to start the Solutions framework. And the Solutions framework really offered a way for me to think about telling hopeful stories in a responsible way that, to Lisa's point, doesn't, oversimplify things or give the reader the impression that there's a silver bullet when there's not really a silver bullet to homelessness. If there was, we would probably all be doing what we had to do to make that happen. So I'll go through the framework with this slide. Here we are. Let's see. I think that's shared. Great. Okay, so this is going to be a very brief introduction. There's so many more resources available if you are not familiar with the framework and want more information, and I'll also have my email address up at the end. I'm happy to talk solutions anytime. So we're going to go over the basics. So the basic definition of solutions journalism is rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. So homelessness obviously is a societal problem that we're all talking about how to improve and how to make better. And so this is ripe for a solutions framework. I think rigorous and evidence-based are really important words in that. So there's the important piece of the storytelling and the lived experience that we've talked about, that Lisa's articulated so well. But we also, and she also spoke about the data, which is also needs to be included in a solid solution story. And the rigor is the piece that speaks to not framing a story or framing a solution as a silver bullet. So what does that look like, and how do you do that in an individual story as a reporter or an editor working through that framework? So the first ingredient for a solution story is that you are reporting on a response. So again, it's not that so there's the silver bullet, which can be a kind of a I think they call it a false solution story. I don't know that false is the right word for it, but it can kind of masquerade as a solution story. Sometimes you can have a profile that can seem like a solution story, but it's based around an individual person, and they may be very worthy of that recognition. But obviously we are each individuals, and we want to look at a system rather than an individual to have a really robust conversation about what's possible. And then also, often you will unpack what an organization does, but you want to frame it a little bit more broadly in how that organization is working on a problem and what's effective and what's not effective about what they're doing. So response to a problem is the first piece. Second, we've talked about a little bit is evidence. So you want as much as possible to be able to have data, and this speaks to a lot of what the National Alliance brings forward, where how do we know that this response is working? Where are we seeing reductions in the number of people entering homelessness? Where are we seeing increases in the people who are being permanently housed? So obviously, this can be a little bit tricky in some spaces. I've worked a lot on solutions in the climate space where there's not always evidence for just specific programs. And I imagine that in the solutions or in the homelessness space, that can also be true. You want to try to do the best you can to bring evidence forward. And in the end, at some point, you may feel each of these pieces may sometimes be a bit deficient, and that's okay, because this is an exercise that you'll keep doing and you'll keep improving and you'll get more data and more evidence as you continue along. But these are definitely what you should strive for and the goals in a solid solutions story. Discuss limitations. So you want to be really transparent about what you don't know. So with the evidence, you may not have you may have only anecdotal evidence that you've brought forward, but you want to discuss this program is so new that there's not effective, or there's not a full, year of data on what has worked, or how it's worked. So that's a piece of, bringing credibility to your reporting, and also making sure that you give the readers the opportunity to discuss what might be problematic or something to watch out for about this response that you're presenting. And finally, seek to provide insights that can help others respond. So this one can be really tricky to come to, and often I've found in working with reporters that you arrive at that sort of through the reporting, and sometimes even through the writing of the story, like, okay, this is what this program or this response represents. And this is what I think people in my community or people in other communities who are looking at my community might be able to take from it. And I think I'll breeze through because I know we're coming up on the 10 minutes to the end, and I want to make sure we have time to answer any questions. But you do want to make sure that a response has some merit to looking at it closely and presenting it to readers to really think about. That can be a discussion with your editor. It can be a discussion with other reporters, or maybe even people who are working in that space who are like, this is a really interesting response that I haven't seen before. I'll breeze through this. We have evidence insights. This sort of takes a look at why each of those pillars is what the Solutions Journalism Network calls them. How those kind of keep the framework of your story out of the space of advocacy or out of the space of sort of presenting something as what you should be striving for, without kind of giving the reader the space to discuss what this looks like and where the limitations are. And I can share this slide later, or this deck, with Libby later on so that she can share it out, because I don't want to take too much time. But I also have my email address, and I'm always happy to talk solutions and workshop ideas with people. So I think I'll stop there. I know we're coming up to 8 minutes to the end of the hour.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. So, maybe just to close, if do you have some sort of idea of how a reporter might apply this sort of framework to a story on homelessness or housing affordability?
Yeah, I think that one really simple thing that I've employed is, as you're out interviewing people who are working in that space or are having the lived experience of homelessness, or even anyone who's working around on the topic, I always ask people, often you're going to hear, sad stories, difficult, you're going to hear about difficult decisions. I always ask people, what makes you hopeful? And I make note of that. And sometimes actually it takes, like, as journalists, we have a negativity bias, but I think as people working on these really thorny issues, it can be hard to see what is hopeful in that as well. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time, and people have to, I usually say, you know, if you don't know right now, get back to me. And sometimes it's something that's happening within the community that makes them hopeful. Sometimes it's that, oh, I've heard about this program going on in this other community that's really interesting. And I have done, I've compiled lists when I've started plotting out coverage on a particular issue. And that's been the fodder for us to start to match that list of what makes people hopeful with what the issues in our community are, and kind of see where those two things line up is where I've started to look for the possibility of doing the solution story.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just offer that our previous webinar, which folks can watch, we had 3 communities come on who talked about some successes that they've seen. This was in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Santa Cruz, California, and Dallas, Texas. So those are 3 communities that you might, want to reach out to or look at what they're doing in terms of reducing the homelessness population. There was some of the work that they've been doing. So thank you so much, Emilie. I know we are getting close. I don't see any Q&A in the chat, so I'm going to toss it back to Daniel, who's going to close us out. And both Emilie and Lisa have graciously shared their emails. So if you have questions for either of them, please reach out. And then the Solutions Journalism Network is a great resource. I used to be a reporter and I used it when I was a reporter. They have different webinars and things that are very useful as you're thinking about your reporting. Daniel, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Libby, and thank you so much, Emilie and Lisa. I loved both of the attention that you both placed on needing to spend the time learning and speaking to people and acknowledge gaps in data when they exist. And I think we're often interested at the Alliance and find it really useful to look at all these various data sources. And especially things like performance measures or the annual homelessness assessment reports. We love to look at things like inflow and outflow, and we also struggle with those because sometimes different data points can tell us so many different things. So especially at the local level for reporters or even at the state level, I think you all have the opportunity to really explore this nuance, which is so necessary. For example, sometimes a low exit rate from shelter to housing indicates that shelter isn't operating effectively, or folks like to make that argument, but we also know that there's only 36 affordable and available beds or units for every 100 extremely low income renters in the United States. And so it's far more likely that matching people with a permanent home is just becoming increasingly difficult unless more affordable housing is preserved and developed. And so I just note that example to emphasize how important the work that you all are doing is, of not only pulling the data, but also finding ways to examine and acknowledge its context. So thank you all so much for being here. Again, thank you to Emilie and Lisa for providing such valuable context to this conversation. And please feel free to reach out to Libby and to the Alliance, as well as to Lisa and Emilie if you have additional questions or would like to discuss what you are working on. Thank you again, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.